Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody this morning to the first session in what it will be a 10-week session looking at this theme of socially generative innovation for development. And I'm going to say a lot more about what all of these terms mean, but I think the fundamental question that we're asking is how can we think about technology and innovation in the context of development in ways that allow us to really facilitate the ability of individuals and households and communities to use that technology in productive and generative ways to improve their lives. And so it's just fantastic to be here with you and to have this opportunity to share with you both some of the ideas that underpin work that we've been doing here at Arizona State University in collaboration with colleagues all over the world in Sierra Leone, in South Asia, in Uganda and Brazil and Puerto Rico. It's just been a great last, say, 5 to 7 years, particularly with my colleague, Dr. Sara Biswas, who has been a PhD student of mine during that time period and recently finished his PhD and is now a postdoc. He's just done a fantastic job leading efforts to understand how we can kind of put technology to very productive uses and to build the kind of data infrastructures around that we need to be successful in communities. So really thinking about how can we transform the development exercise into a kind of data-centered perspective for communities. And it's also been a pleasure over the last 6 months or so to get to know Lori, the CEO of Global Stratos, as a partner in thinking about how we can take technology and data and allow communities to find new ways to kind of create community-centered innovation. So Lori, do you want to say any words here at the beginning, just of welcome?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So again, yeah, my name is Lori Elliott, and we are focused on looking at existing value chains with small producers, and then the communities that are often tied to those production sites, and finding ways locally, that they can benefit each other to expand their socioeconomic development. And so we partnered with ASU with their experience to look at how we can bring the community, fully participative in that process of innovation, and also using data for development. Thank you, Clark.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you. It's great opportunity to be working with you. As I said at the beginning, our vision here is to, for this 10-week course, is really to think about these two paired ideas. One of which is socially generative innovation. And then the second is data-centered development. And how can we bring these two ideas together to really push forward? And I think if you look at the kind of outline of the course, we're going to spend sort of the first 3 sessions really focused on building a comprehensive kind of framework for thinking about how can we do innovation in ways that's socially generative. And then we're going to spend the rest of the course building a set of ideas about how we can pursue that kind of innovation in community-centered, collaborative, data-centric ways. So let me just start with this question: what is socially generative innovation? And when we think about generativity, at least from our perspective, when I'm thinking about what does it mean to be generative in a development context, I really center that. And Sarah has really been the one who's kind of built this infrastructure in the ideas of a capabilities approach as introduced by Amartya Sen, of course, who's the Nobel Prize winner in economics, who really emphasized for us this idea of development as centered on the capabilities that people have, not just kind of in an internal sense, right? Knowledge and skills, although those are all are critically important, but also in a sense of the kind of structures in society and the market that support the individual or the household in exercising those capabilities to be able to pursue development, right? And so Sen observed for us this, kind of basic facts about the world. He spent a lot of time working on hunger, for example. And, if you look at kind of global averages of things like GDP per capita or per capita food intake or per capita energy consumption, there are not shortages, right? There's plenty of wealth and food and energy to go around for the entire world. And so what Sen observed, particularly looking at famines, spent a lot of time studying famines, is that things like poverty and hunger and a lack of access to energy do not stem from a lack of supply, right? This is a problematic way of looking at them. We often think about famine and we think about, failures of harvests, right? And we say, well, oh, that famine was caused because the weather created a shortage of food supply. Well, no, right? We have always had substantial food supplies around the world to be able to feed everyone. Rather, famines occur and poverty and lack of access to energy occur because we have market and social and political arrangements that fail to empower people to acquire sufficient resources to support themselves, to support their households, to support their communities, right? Some of these may simply be what we would call market failures, right? The failure of market institutions to, for example, distribute food equally, particularly in contexts where there are regional shortfalls, for example. Others may occur because of discrete and deliberate political strategies to create shortages, right? And so what Sen argued, right, is that what we need to do when we pursue development is to facilitate the capabilities of people, right, to create markets and social and political arrangements that empower people to secure the resources that they need to live, to pursue their livelihoods, and ultimately to thrive. Right, so this is this vision of a kind of capabilities approach to thinking about what we're trying to do in development. And so what we say, right, is that if people are empowered with the capabilities that they need to make changes in their lives, so that over time their lives become progressively better and better, that's what we call generativity. It's this idea that the systems and the arrangements within which people are living and their ability to live and pursue livelihoods within those systems together are allowing them to improve their lives over time. That's what it means to be generative. And so we then define socially generative innovation as innovation, right? The development and deployment of technologies in context, right? As generative, socially generative, if that innovation empowers people to make changes in their lives that perpetually increase thriving and well-being. And so I want to just highlight, and I'm going to reiterate this throughout this kind of introduction to the topic, right? That we're switching the focus here in a fairly important way in terms of thinking about innovation, from thinking about the development and design of technologies to instead thinking about the context of the people who are using those technologies. Because the critical feature here is that the innovation has to empower people. And if it isn't empowering people, right, then it's not socially generative innovation. It's just some random technology that we've put out there in the world that nobody is either using or able to use effectively to improve their lives, right? And so we really have to shift focus from spending a lot of time thinking about what are the technologies and how are we going to put them out there and what are they going to cost, right? To instead thinking about how are people going to use those technologies in their lives, in their livelihoods, to empower themselves, right? And that's kind of the shift in focus from a kind of technology-based innovation approach to a socially generative innovation approach. Really re-emphasizes where we're putting our attention from technology design to technology use. So what I want to argue is that generativity here as well is the key to designing high impact development projects. So what do I mean by that? Well, you know, if you think about the kind of wisdom that often kind of circulates, right? These two phrases that go together, right? If you give a person a fish, she will feed her family for a day. If you teach that person to fish, she'll be able to feed her family every day, right? And so that's this kind of core idea of generativity, right? Is we switch from, right, thinking about the delivery of a service or the delivery of a product to instead thinking about how someone can use that to enhance their capabilities, right? And so you can actually take this forward, right? So if you think about not just teaching someone to fish, but teaching them to innovate in how they fish, right? Teaching them to get better with regard to their fishing over time, then of course that person can improve their catch. They can catch more fish and they can have excess fish, which can be shared with neighbors and friends, right? Which can be shared with the market and create a revenue stream, right? And of course, if not only this person is able to innovate, but we create the conditions under which they can share those innovations with others, right? Then we have a situation in which those others can thrive as well, right? And so we're really thinking about how do we empower people to improve their lives and their livelihoods over time by going from these kind of early ideas about delivering technologies to them or services or products to thinking about how do we learn, how do we innovate, and ultimately how do we help others to learn in that same kind of context, right? And so we're moving projects down this sequence to the point where we're creating high impact projects that have real long-term value creation in the communities, right? And so we can really see in this sense that if we create generative projects, we can drive improvements on a whole suite of SDG outcomes, from thinking about, in this particular context, improving on nutrition and adequate nutritional intake, to thinking about education, to thinking about revenue, new revenue streams, and improvement, helping people get out of poverty, right, to really community empowerment, and gender equality, right? So there's all kinds of SDG outcomes embedded in these kind of generative projects, if we can figure out how to create them, right? And I want to highlight, right, because generative projects drive multiple SDG outcomes over time, they're also more bankable, right? So if you're thinking about how do we finance these projects, right, we see this in the energy space all the time. One of the challenges for a lot of remote rural energy projects is they're costly, and the communities are rarely in a position to pay for high levels of energy consumption that would be required to make a project financially make sense. And so all over the world, we've seen shortfalls in the delivery of rural electrification projects, because financially it's just really hard to make them work out in terms of the kind of net return on that investment versus the initial investment that's required to build that energy project. And in fact, we see that in the United States when we're working with low-income communities and we're thinking about solar projects, for example. They're just expensive, and it's hard to figure out how, even over the lifetime, 20-year lifetime of a solar project, people can afford to pay enough to pay back those investments, let alone to generate the kind of ROI that a bank would expect, right? On the other hand, if you can create a generative project in which that availability of energy, because people are able to put it to use impactfully in their lives, and especially in their livelihoods, so that they're generating productive uses of that energy. They're leveraging that energy in ways that allow them to earn higher levels of revenue, then you can get improved local economic development. That improved local economic development then feeds back, and I'll say more about this in a minute, creates revenue streams. It creates the ability, and not only the ability, but the willingness and even growth over time in payment for electricity services, right? So you get these more bankable projects if you can generate these kind of high impact generativity in communities. So how does this work in practice? Let me talk specifically some more about this example of SDG 7, right? The idea of creating universal access to affordable and clean energy. So typically, the focus of projects that are really emphasizing SDG 7 is on delivering technology and on figuring out how much that technology will cost. We call this, in the energy space, the techno-economics of the project. And it's all about the design of the project, the delivery of the technology, and who's going to finance that, right? Who's going to pay for, in this picture, all of these solar panels that are going in. And I want to suggest, right, that in our approach, the question is, for a project like this, are these solar panels socially generative? When you stop and think about it, you say, well, I just don't know, right? Because here, let me go back and show you the picture, right? We have no information, no insight of how this energy is going to be used, right? From this picture itself. And actually, this is a remarkably consistent feature of SDG 7 projects around the globe. Of course, there are exceptions. But for example, we've been working in Pakistan with a group of engineers at the University of Engineering and Technology in Peshawar, which sits up on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And they did a planning project for hundreds of micro hydro projects all throughout that region. These were going to be village scale, small dams that would have hydroelectric facilities attached to them. And the engineers at the university, this was a government project, and they produced this enormous report in planning for all of these hydroelectric projects. And when we had a chance to look at this report, they had done intricate engineering calculations of all of the locations where they were going to put these dams. They had looked at the stream flow associated with all the streams that they were going to dam. They had demonstrated that in every site, they were going to be able to produce a certain amount of power. They had even done some environmental analyses to suggest that damming these particular streams was not going to cause environmental problems. And there were 0 words in the entire report about how any of these communities was going to use any of the energy that was produced productively or even at all, right? There was simply an assumption that people would figure out how to use the energy and how to pay for it. And we were just like, it boggled our minds, right? Because we've been thinking in this completely opposite way of wanting to ask, how is it that people can actually take this new technology that you're creating in their lives and use it to empower themselves to create what we call social value? That is, to create value in their own lives and livelihoods, as well as in the lives of their children and the lives and livelihoods of their neighbors, right? So the whole point of development is to think about how we can help individuals and communities create more value, where value is maybe partly an economic concept here, right? We obviously want to create economic value of different kinds, but it's also a social concept, right? We're interested in creating health value. We're interested in creating educational value, right? Community well-being type value. So value is a broad concept here when we talk about the social value of technology or innovation, or in this particular context, energy. We're talking about how are people actually going to use that energy to create value in ways that isn't just a single value creation exercise, right? The whole point of generativity is it's recursive. It happens again and again and again and again and again. It feeds back on itself so that we go from making a one-time improvement in people's lives to creating capabilities for people that allow them to create value again and again and again, right, over time. So that it's recursive, it's a positive feedback loop, right? And we want to create energy systems or technology systems that are supportive of that positive feedback loop. That's that whole idea of the capabilities approach from Sen. We want to create structures that are empowering of people to progressively do better and better and better and better, right, over time. And that's thinking about, like an energy project, or these days there's a lot of emphasis on connecting these communities with remote communication technologies, Wi-Fi systems, cellular communications, right? Bringing them into high-speed data connectivity with the rest of the world. But the same idea applies. It's not enough to say, we brought you this service, you can now connect. It's about understanding, how do we make sure that that system is creating a structure in the community that's empowering the community, right? So we have to think about how the people and the technology connect together effectively in order to create social value, right? So let's think about this. Saurabh's gonna laugh when he sees this, because I've been telling this story now for 2 years, but nobody's ever seen a picture of my pump before. So this is a water pump that's in my backyard. It's an unbelievably fancy water pump. It's a variable speed water pump. It's got a computer chip in it that it allows me to program it to do all kinds of amazing things. I can tell it what speed to pump at. I can have it pump at certain times of the day and night. I mean, just all kinds of cool things that you could do with this pump. The problem is that when this pump was installed, I wasn't here. I was away for the day. And so nobody taught me how to actually program this pump. And the manual that came with this pump is, let's just say, bad, right? It is at one level incomprehensible and does not help me figure out how to program this pump. So this pump has been sitting in my backyard, and essentially that whole time, 2 years, it's been doing exactly the same thing that it was programmed to do by the people who installed it, because I don't know how to change it. And I have multiple degrees in electrical engineering. So it's not like I'm incapable of reprogramming this pump, right? I just don't know how to do it. I don't have the knowledge. I don't have the skills. And so I can't use this pump to the maximum kind of impact that I could have with it. I can't use it to save energy over what I would like to do, right? I can't use it to pump when I'd like it to pump, as opposed to when I don't want it to pump, right? Because I don't know how, right? So when we think about technologies and bringing them into people's lives, we need to design projects that integrate the technology with the knowledge, with the skills, but also with the context that is empowering them to use that technology to create that value. If we don't, that technology, I mean, at best, it's partially useful, and at worst, it's useless. And, there are lots and lots and lots of stories of solar panels in various places around the world that have been installed in projects and then don't work for a variety of reasons. In fact, my student who's here with us today, Giamar, and I were talking about this yesterday, because they were going around a community in Puerto Rico and looking at solar and battery systems that had been installed over the past few years in individual homes, and discovering that a number of them don't work as they were originally installed to work. Either not working at all or working only partially, right? And so, the whole idea of technology is not to just deliver it to people, right? But to use it to create context where it empowers people. And that's this idea of creating projects that have social value, or that allow people, empower people even to create social value. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story here about this solar project. It's a solar project in Nepal that my colleague, who will join us in a few sessions down the road, Netra Chetri, has been involved with building. And it's a co-designed project with a community. It's a farming community in the mountains of Nepal. And we're in this project, right? It's not just about building a solar project, because again, the whole idea here is, how are people going to use the energy from this solar project to create value in their lives? And so what they've done in this particular project, so again, as I say, it's an agricultural community. And one of the challenges in this community is that while they have a wet season, which you saw in the last picture, they also have a dry season. And during that dry season, they need water to irrigate their crops in the community. And the water, unfortunately, in the dry season is at the bottom of the mountain, while they're at the top of the mountain. And so they need a capacity to pump that water up. And so they use the solar energy for that water pumping, right? So in order to design this, the community got together and started to think about these questions, right? Does the user have a use for the energy? And what is that use? What can they do with this energy that will add value in their lives, right? So is that energy use valuable for the user, right? We have to ask these questions and don't make assumptions here, right? So we say, oh, well, of course, if you could power lights at night, that would be useful. Okay, how would it be useful for this community? How are they actually going to create value out of having that light, right? Do they have the necessary knowledge and skills to use the energy in ways that create value? This isn't just a matter of pumping water. This is a community project. They put a fair amount of community money into building this solar system. And so the community as a whole has to get value out of it, which means that they had to create irrigation structures that move the water around. They had to find ways to do shared governance, right? So somebody had to learn how to make the water pump work. Somebody had to learn how to fix the solar system if it decided not to work. But they also, as a community, had to learn shared governance of this new resource, this new water resource, in order to be able to make sure that everybody got access to it when they needed the water, right? Because, I mean, if you don't get water when the crops need it, right, the crop gets stunted or the crop dies, right? So you've got to think about this as a kind of complex water delivery system, right? And there are going to be conflicts. And so how do you manage those conflicts, right? All of these skills and knowledge had to be developed in order to make, in the community itself, in order to make this system work collaboratively. And then, is that value tangible, right? Is the use of that energy in this way not just nice to have, but is it actually increasing, in this case, crop yields, so that people have more food that they can sell into the marketplace and generate a higher level of economic return on the investment in this project, right? So thinking about how we do social value of energy, really, again, to come back to this point from earlier, we really have to shift our focus from how do we design this technology. I mean, frankly, these days, solar systems with water pumps are not hard to do technologically, but it's we had to do a whole lot more in this project in order to make it socially generative and socially valuable. And so we really have to rethink the design of that technology. We need to think about what energy services does the user need, not just how much energy do they need, but which particular energy services do they need, right? A whole bunch of our emphasis in a lot of this work has been people don't care about energy. They care about energy services. They care about light, they care about heat, they care about cooling, they care about being able to do work like run a drill, right? They care about being able to move water. They care about being able to move goods and services and people around, right? They don't care about electrons. They don't care about fuel. They care about what they can do with that fuel. So what are those services? Is the energy system configured to deliver those services? Right? If we're thinking about we have to think about where people need the energy and the energy services, not just and when, not just that they need them, right? So that we can make sure in this case, right? Where did they need the energy? They needed the energy where they could pump the water up into their irrigation system. So we had to put the energy system in that location, right? Is it configured to deliver those services? Where and when they're needed, and in ways that create this kind of multi-dimensional returns for the users of the energy, for the users of the community. And if we do that, right, and this is a picture of the community water bill from this project, right? So they actually charge people for the water that this energy is pumping to help them pay back the investment in the energy system and to create a community fund that can be used to pursue additional projects down the line, right? That's this idea of generativity, of not just paying back over time, but creating new capacities to invest on behalf of the community, right? So in order to do that, you have to think about how are people using this energy to create tangible and meaningful value that then allows them to pay back into that system, allows them to create new kinds of investments that go forward, right? So we're thinking of if you can do that, right, then people can use the energy more effectively. They can use more energy. And what does that mean? That means we can grow these systems over time. One of the, I think, fallacies of a lot of development work, especially in the energy space, but I think in other spaces as well, is the kind of static nature of projects. Oh, we're going to build a solar system. No, you want to build a combined set of solar and human systems that work so that people's lives get better and they actually demand more energy and they have the ability to pay for that energy. And so they can, over time, grow the size and scale of that system, right? That's what we have to be thinking about, right? And if you can do that, you're growing the ability of people to pay for energy over time, which means that not only are they going to want projects to be upgraded over time, they're going to be able to derive social impact from the project. They're going to see the value of the energy. They're going to want to pay for that energy. And in doing so, they're going to be positioned to pay back the original investors. And so if we can demonstrate how this is going to work, can demonstrate that impact that's going to be had on the social side, right? That's going to make the project more compelling to investors, whether those investors are governments that are interested in community development, or whether those investors are banks that are interested in generating that return on investment. Unfortunately, I just want to introduce one other term here. A lot of rural energy projects, and I won't speak for other technologies, although I suspect it's also true for them as well, but I'm not as familiar with that space, right? A lot of those projects end up being not generative in the sense that they create positive feedback loops that enhance people's lives over time, but rather they end up being extractive, meaning they actually extract resources over time from the community, and they create negative feedback loops so that the net overall interaction is destructive over time. And I want to, just tell one little story here. Lori, I see your hand, and I will. I'm just about done, so I'll connect with you in a second for your question. But this idea of extractive is illustrated by a debate that was happening in a European electricity utility that was pursuing development projects in Africa. And they were having a debate between their corporate social responsibility group and the operations group that was going to be building and implementing the projects. And the debate was over whether or not to include free televisions in the development projects. And the argument from the standpoint of the operations team was that if you gave people free televisions and connected them up to these electricity systems that you were bringing in to these villages for the first time, then you would have a higher guarantee that they would continue to pay their electricity bills, because they wouldn't want to get their electricity service shut off, because they wouldn't want to lose their TV service, right? And if you think about it, that is a very kind of problematic approach to energy system development, because you're providing people with a service that doesn't ultimately often have a lot of value in a tangible or a meaningful sense, but you're finding a way to guarantee that they will continue to send you their what last little bit of disposable income they have in their lives, regardless of whether the energy project ultimately creates value in their lives or not, right? And we've seen, again, lots and lots and lots of cases of these kinds of projects that end up making people worse. And I'm going to spend a lot of time in the next session next week talking about these negative feedback loops and how they persist in a lot of existing energy systems and technology systems, and how we can avoid them. So what I want to end with is, just to synthesize, we need a kind of multifaceted approach to technology-based development projects that centers users, centers the use value of technology, and that understands how human systems and technological systems work together to empower people, and it assesses itself, this development approach, on whether or not it creates generativity, that is positive feedback loops over time in the community, or extraction, that is negative feedback loops over time in the community. And data is absolutely central to this, right? And we saw that in that sheet from the Nepal project, right? Community created, community curated data is absolutely key to designing these projects and empowering people to create social value and social generativity over time. It's kind of the knowledge base, right? It becomes that community built knowledge base for self-learning and innovation, for self-inquiry into current and potential future value creation, the ability to do self-assessment of project benefits, costs, burdens, and risks, and the self-integration of new energy technologies into existing human systems. So thank you, and Lori, please.
Yes, I just wanted to make a couple comments just in light of, just to broaden it.
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
Clark said, you were speaking to energy as the example throughout this workshop. And so in our context, energy would be one of the things We actually put in a lot of different, if you want to call soft and hard infrastructure, but we drive it by an economic base so that it gives, let's say, the farmers or the small scale miners more of a thriving economy, right? And then the infrastructure we put in along with that process that we use, we also extend to them to some degree so that they can use it. So we are, in a sense, doing the heavy intervention up front of both putting in the infrastructure, but also modeling how it can be used, and then working with the communities and the producers to actually use it and figure out how they want to use it. Okay, is that making sense?
Yeah, I'm just, this is why, Lori, our partnership is so exciting, right? Because you take this fundamental insight that you need to create that kind of valuable use of the project, whatever that project is, right? If you're bringing energy into a mining process or into an agricultural community, right? You're focused in that very first instance on what is that first use value of that. And that's everything. And then you take an approach that is all about building the capacity of the community to leverage that opportunity to do more and more and more and more over time, right?
Exactly.
To find new uses for that energy, to find new uses for their connected Wi-Fi communication capabilities, to learn and do this kind of data-centered innovation in the community itself, right? So yeah, I think that's exactly the reason why we think the stuff that you're doing connects so nicely into this framework.
Yep. And I was going to say that just to give you an example outside of energy. So, when we talk about working with artisanal miners, which is, they're, even if it's not gold or battery minerals, they're artisanal miners in a lot of developing countries. And typically, let's say it's gold or it's the diamonds or it's the battery minerals. In order for them to be legal, there's all of these principles that are set out in Europe or the United States, laws that legislate how things should be done, how they should be transparent, and supposedly they're supposed to prevent exploitation of the miners. But actually, they just created a structure that continues it and adds actually more burden to the miners. So if we look at the Congo, for example, they have fair trade for coltan and cobalt and several other value chains, tin included. And what's happened is the miners have to do additional things to prove that they're, pulling something from somewhere and have someone register that, right? And so they're actually producing less and they're making less money because nobody's actually looking at how to improve the productivity by putting in machines, by educating them on how to do basic exploration, all the different things that would actually make it a thriving thing for the community and for the miners, okay? And so when I look at those systems, that's 99% of our systems, okay? So this is not an aberration. This is the way it's been done and continues to be done. And another way of looking at it is private companies come in after the artisanal miners and they get the concession when the miners have actually proven, because they're digging out quantities manually, right? That there's something there. Now, the economic value of a particular site, there's more that goes into it than that. But if someone deems that they believe that they can make money at that site, why are the miners only considered to be employees instead of finding a way generatively to get them to do their own concessions, to be generative, so that the community is actually really growing from that process, not just basically, stripped of potential ownership or, additional revenue benefits other than employees. So these are, and remember, a lot of these groups, they've lived on that land for hundreds of years, okay? And they get the negative brunt of mostly everything that goes on, even with production, even with all of that. They get stripped a lot of rights and other things when larger companies come in, because they do not have the capacity to partner, okay? Because they do not have the capacity, they can advocate for themselves. There's been a lot of advocacy going on, right? And that works to a certain degree, but it often leaves people in the same place. Okay, well, yeah, we've advocated, we may be keeping more of our rights, but we're still poor, right? So that's where we see that the systems are just not designed to empower people. And so our goal is to develop generative projects that just continue to allow people to be capacitized, empowered, and take advantage of the natural resource wealth sustainably, right? Not just, the way it's been done, for their own benefit. And so, yeah, so this, like you said, it's like a perfect marriage for us, because you've done a lot of work in this area, and it helps us. I think right now I'm just thinking, oh, wow, it's going to be really easy for me to do our impact metrics against the SDGs based on this, just the simple definition that you gave of social value and generativity, because that's what we're actually focused on. But you gave us a very nice, concise thing that, I can now, instead of trying to explain it in a paragraph, I can explain in a sentence. So thank you very much for that, Clark.
Oh, you bet. You bet. Other questions or thoughts? Thank you for sharing. Somebody raised their hand. Jomo.
Hello all, my name is Jomo and I'm from Guyana. Professor, I have a pump similar to yours, but it's not so sophisticated. I actually have to use a screwdriver if I want to adjust any settings. I would have to open a compartment to be able to do that. So back on to the substantive matter. In Guyana, we have two types of solar installations. We have one solar farm, and we have some standalone installations that are used to provide a small amount of power to individual homeowners, and both are applicable to interior or indigenous settings. So in terms of the solar farm, it's only a 400 kW farm, 400 kilowatt. And actually, as you were making a presentation, Professor, I saw so many parallels with respect to Guyana. You could easily have been speaking about Guyana there. So for example, this 400 kilowatt farm, it was installed, but it did not provide any power to residents for an entire year after that period, simply because the batteries were not in place, right? So that was unfortunate. I do not think any generative processes is happening there, as far as I know, and no social value. I think that this farm is used only to provide some power to residents for basic home needs, right? So I think in Guyana, we need to build farms with higher capacity. And we're probably thinking, a few of us, of going the route of concentrated solar power plants. The other type of installation, which are the standalone, these are used to provide power to thousands of homeowners in the indigenous community. My colleague and my compatriot, Patrick, can probably give figures with respect to how many. But these are only used basically to provide lighting, maybe just one light, and to power one socket outlet, right? So we do not have any sort of social value solar projects in our country. And of course, a few of us, especially Mahendra, who unfortunately is not here today, is working on correcting that. So that's my contribution.
Thanks, Jomo. It's really interesting to hear the example from Guyana. And no, I think these are endemic problems in many places, including here in the United States. So,
Clark, there's a
yeah.
comment. There's a comment in the chat, question rather.
Yeah, I was just answering that for McGillway.
Oh, okay. I thought so. Okay, great.
And you know, I think I don't know why this, you know, this idea of a kind of capabilities approach that allows, not only allows, but really creates structures and contexts that empower people to progressively improve their lives over time. I don't know why it isn't sort of the design focus of more projects. It's certainly been around for quite a while now, although, you know, I think a piece of it certainly and again, we see this in the energy sector. I can't speak to other sectors because I don't spend a lot of time in them. Although my colleagues who do sort of ICT for development tell me similar things happen there. But a lot of the design of projects is done by engineers, and nothing against engineers. About half the people on this call are engineers. And engineers are obviously crucial. I mean, you know, building a solar system actually turns out isn't all that straightforward. There are lots of ways that even a simple solar installation can go wrong if you don't get the engineering right? So getting the engineering right is absolutely critical. But the challenge is that when you think about these only as engineering projects, and this is unfortunately a history of kind of engineering as a discipline, is that they have not, I mean, I have many years of training as an engineer. I spend a lot of time in undergraduate engineering classes trying to correct this, but undergraduate and master's level engineering training, even PhD level engineering training, there just isn't a lot of emphasis on what happens to technologies when people are using them so that they can use them effectively, and how you design those integrated relationships so that the people and the technology fit very well together. You just don't train engineers to think about those things. And so when we define an energy project as an engineering project, we tend to leave those elements of the conversation out. We've reached the end. McGillway, I am aware of your question about examples of practical generative concept. Certainly that's what I was trying to do with this Nepal project example. And I will talk about some more practical examples, and Sarab will also talk about some more practical examples as we go through the course. But I'll make sure that we put those in so that you get them next time, okay?
Okay. Yeah, and Clark, I would just like Ryan Blumenau, who's our Chief Data Officer, to make a comment, because he used to work with large consulting firms on energy project development. So I think he can give a really interesting perspective on bankability and some of these issues. Ryan, would you just do
That'd
a brief?
Be great, Ryan.
Sure, yeah, happy to. And I mean, I think the comment that I kind of want to make actually ties back to the question that was asked in the chat about whether this generative concept is new, or has it been in the field in the past and it just hasn't been used effectively, and what are the reasons for that? And I mean, the stark reality is that large project development and even small project development follows the money, right? I mean, full disclosure is that my background is in economics, in data science, in finance, infrastructure development, and you know, I've had very long conversations with a lot of friends of mine who are, you know, very well established engineers. And, you know, the stark reality is that as cool as a solution may be, project development, particularly when you're talking about project development in developing nations, it always follows the money. You can't have, you know, any sort of bankable investment case unless you have thought about how you're going to monetize and get a return on investment on the investment that you're making. And with a lot of these generative, socially focused project ideas that have been floated in the past, that link to financial return, that link to bankability has really been missing. You know, and so there've been a lot of really cool ideas for how you can, you know, promulgate socially conscious project development, particularly in the developing nations, but that link to how do we actually make any money off of that is lost. And when you're talking to you know, funding institutions, when you're talking to grant donors, when you're talking to, you know, multilateral development corporations, really typically what people are looking for is a bankable feasibility study, and emphasis there is on the word bankable, because lots of people have feasibility studies or pre-feasibility studies that they've completed that show they have a particular project idea that they think may solve a particular problem. But what they haven't done in a lot of cases is taken that next step to say, well, okay, but how do we actually get the rubber to meet the road in implementation? How do we get the rubber to hit the road in terms of monetization, in terms of return on investment? And so, sort of to answer the question that was in the chat, in terms of my own experience working in Africa with the US government on large project development, typically what we found is that there are a range of different solutions to different types of problems. But the ones that typically tend to move forward to implementation with the backing of the financial institutions, with the backing of the donor institutions, are those that have thought through that next step of, you know, how do we make sure that this is a sustainable financial investment and not only a sustainable social investment, because a sustainable social investment is actually very difficult to monetize in a lot of cases. That's why there are all sorts of things in the economics realm around social return on investment and, you know, trying to unpack what the metrics may mean. But typically those things are much more difficult to make a business case out of. And so typically the projects that tend to succeed are the ones that have taken that next step of thinking, what does the financial landscape look like? How do I put this project in an environment where I'm actually able to make some sort of money out of it? And I mean, let's be honest, in a lot of cases, that leaves a bad taste in the mouth of people, you know, because they're thinking, you know, social development shouldn't come at the cost of, you know, having to make some sort of financial case. But again, the stark reality is that project development needs to be backed by some sort of monetization process, and typically that needs a bankable study behind it.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think that's incredibly important, and it's actually one of the reasons why we've been a little bit stumped about why, say, for example, in rural electrification projects, so little attention gets paid to these questions of where that value creation is going to happen for the users. Because if the users of the energy are not creating value, and often in this sense, in a financial sense, right, financial value from the project, where is the money going to come from to pay back and pay forward for the investors? So yeah. I really agree. I really agree.
That really is a great point, and it speaks very saliently to the point that was raised by Noel in the chat around patient capital. And I mean, you know, in an ideal world, we would always have investment funding available with a long-term time horizon attached to it to allow for these socially conscious projects to be developed. But again, the reality is that for the people that actually provide the upfront capital expenditure for these projects, they're typically evaluating between several different projects at a time, and the one that gives them the biggest return on investment in the shortest space of time is the one that wins. So, you know, there's a lot of sort of rhetoric that goes around in infrastructure development circles around, you know, how do we make people more socially conscious? And in my personal opinion, I actually think we should go the other way to say, how do we take socially conscious project developers and make them more financially, you know, forward thinking? let's put a business case to a project that actually has social foundations to it, and that will naturally get the CapEx flow.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks, Ryan. Really appreciate your perspective. Thanks, everybody. This has been a really great first step. I will try to talk a little bit shorter next time so we have more time for this exchange afterwards, and really looking forward to seeing you next week. So thanks, Lori. Thanks, everybody.